Today, we take you through one of the most impactful events recorded in the United States during the war. Before we begin, I invite you to leave in the comments where you're watching from and the exact time at which you're listening to this narration. We're interested in knowing to which places and at what times of day or night these documented accounts reach. The harbor of Charleston, South Carolina, stirred with an unusual tension on April 11th, 1861. Offshore, the Union supply ship Star of the West rocked gently in the swells, visible but unreachable from the Federal garrison at Fort Sumter. The fort itself stood as an island of Union blue in a sea of newly declared Confederacy. Major Robert Anderson had moved his 85 men from the indefensible Fort Moultrie to Sumter's brick walls on December 26, 1860. Now, after 110 days of increasing isolation, their supplies were critically low. What few understood at the time, and what would remain obscured in military archives for decades, was that aboard the Star of the West served a 27-year-old sailor named Frederick Johnson. Born free in Philadelphia to a dockworker father and a mother who took in washing, Johnson had joined the Merchant Marine at age 17 and had been serving on naval support vessels for 3 years when the secession crisis erupted. His presence aboard the supply ship was documented only in a partial crew manifest, later found in a warehouse in Norfolk, Virginia, when Union forces recaptured the port in 1862. The manifest, filed by Quartermaster Samuel Winters, noted, "Johnson, F., colored seaman assigned to gun crew, Portside Battery." This single line, nearly lost to history, would prove crucial to understanding the events of April 12th. At precisely 4:27 in the morning of April 12th, a signal shot from a Confederate battery on James Island arced over the harbor. Within moments, a barrage of artillery fire erupted from rebel positions surrounding the harbor. The bombardment of Fort Sumter had begun. What happened next would be recorded differently in various accounts, creating a historical puzzle that would confound researchers for generations. According to the official report filed by Lieutenant Adam Gardner, commander of the Star of the West, the vessel came under fire at approximately 4:35 in the morning. "Confederate rounds fell short of our position by 30 yards, Gardner wrote. Following standing orders to protect federal property and personnel, a warning shot was fired across the bow of an approaching rebel steamer. The report does not specify which crew member fired this shot. The first returned fire from Union forces in what would become the American Civil War. A different account emerged in 1863 when a correspondent for Harper's Weekly interviewed crew members of the Star of the West who had rotated back to New York. The article, published on June 7th, noted, "Seaman F. Johnson, described as a free man of color serving with distinction, manned the portside 3-pound gun when Confederate batteries opened fire on Federal vessels." The article was buried on page 17 and attracted little attention amid reports of the Union disaster at Chancellorsville. The Star of the West, unable to reach Fort Sumter through the gauntlet of Confederate fire, was forced to withdraw by 7:15 in the morning. Fort Sumter itself would surrender 34 hours later, after enduring a bombardment that somehow caused no casualties on either side, the bloodless beginning of the bloodiest conflict in American history. Frederick Johnson's role might have remained a footnote in history were it not for a letter discovered in 1865 among the personal effects of Lieutenant Gardner after his death at the Battle of Fort Fisher. Addressed to his brother in Boston, but never sent, the letter described the opening moments of the conflict. "Our colored gunner Johnson showed remarkable coolness under fire. When ordered to respond to rebel batteries, he calibrated the 3-pounder with precision and sent the first Union round of this conflict toward an approaching secessionist vessel. The shot fell short, but served its purpose as warning. This letter contradicted the official Union narrative that emerged after the war, which emphasized the restraint of federal forces at Fort Sumter, who, under Major Anderson's command, held their fire for nearly 2 hours after the Confederate bombardment began. The presence of an armed merchant vessel that not only returned fire, but did so under the direction of a black sailor, complicated the story of Fort Sumter that was taking shape in the North. A story of dignified forbearance in the face of Southern aggression. In the immediate aftermath of the Star of the West's withdrawal, Frederick Johnson's role went unacknowledged. The ship returned to New York, where Johnson continued to serve until August 1861. A paymaster's log from the Brooklyn Navy Yard shows that he was then transferred to the USS Minnesota, a steam frigate assigned to the Union blockade of the Confederacy. What happened aboard the Minnesota remains unclear. A gap appears in Johnson's service record from September 1861 until January 1862. The next documented reference comes from a hospital register at the Portsmouth Naval Hospital in Virginia, where a Seaman F. Johnson, Coldons, was admitted with complications of fever and old wounds. The nature of these wounds was not specified. The hospital register contains another notable entry. In the column marked Personal Effects, the clerk wrote 1 sea bag, 1 uniform coat damaged, 1 journal, water damaged, illegible. This journal, had it survived intact, might have provided first-hand testimony of the opening moments of the Civil War from the perspective of a black sailor who fired what may have been the first Union shot of the conflict. Johnson was discharged from the hospital on February 12, 1862. His name appears once more in naval records on a crew manifest for the USS Wabash, dated April 1862. After that, Frederick Johnson seemingly vanishes from official documentation. The historical record resurfaced him briefly in 1865. A census taker in Philadelphia recorded a Frederick Johnson, age 31, occupation sailor, formerly in U.S. Navy service. This Johnson told the census taker he had served from the first shot to near the last, a claim that matches the timeline of our sailor, but cannot be verified with absolute certainty as being the same man. The final piece of this historical puzzle emerged in 1941, when historian Margaret Wilson discovered a collection of letters in the attic of a boarding house in Baltimore that was being demolished. Among them was correspondence between a Samuel Winterton, possibly the same as Quartermaster Winters from the Star of the West, and a Philadelphia church deacon named James Morris. In a letter dated July 1869, Winterton wrote, "I often think of our colored gunner Johnson and how he stood his post when Charleston Harbor erupted around us. His shot across the Confederate steamer's bow might have sparked a greater conflagration had they observed who stood behind the Union gun. Such is the irony, that a man deemed unfit for equality by rebels might have fired the first answer to their bombardment, yet official reports will never acknowledge such a fact." Deacon Morris's response, dated August 1869, stated simply, "Johnson passed last winter after a long illness. He spoke often of his service, but found no recognition in life for what you have described. I have marked his grave with the words, 'He served when called.'" The grave marker, if it ever existed, has not been found in any Philadelphia cemetery. The boarding house where Johnson reportedly lived his final years was demolished in the 1890s. The church where Deacon Morris served closed in 1911. Even the location of the letters, discovered by historian Wilson, became uncertain after they were removed for preservation, but apparently lost during the transfer to an archive in Washington. What remains are fragments: a crew manifest, a newspaper mention, an unsent letter, hospital records, a census entry, private correspondence, pieces of a story that has never fully cohered in official histories of the Civil War. Military historian Colonel Thomas Hanlon, writing in 1879, summarized the challenge. The official commencement of hostilities is firmly established as the Confederate bombardment of Fort Sumter at 4:30 in the morning, April 12, 1861. Major Anderson's decision to withhold return fire until 7:30 has been much analyzed. Less examined is the naval aspect of these opening hours, particularly the actions of supply vessels in the harbor. Records show discrepancies that may never be fully reconciled. The Star of the West itself met an ignominious end. After several more supply missions, the vessel was captured by Confederate forces on April 17, 1861, in Texas. Renamed the CSS St. Philip, it served the Confederacy until being scuttled in the Tallahatchie River to block Union advances in 1862. Its remains were discovered by Army Corps of Engineers surveyors in 1984, but left undisturbed. The contradiction between official reports and personal accounts extended to Fort Sumter itself. While Major Anderson's report indicated that his garrison first returned fire at 7:30 in the morning, a diary kept by Private Jonathan Webster of the fort's artillery company claimed that our guns spoke back at first light. The diary, preserved in the Massachusetts Historical Society archives, creates further uncertainty about the sequence of events that morning. The question of who fired the first Union shot of the Civil War might seem academic, a matter of minutes or hours in a conflict that would last 4 years and claim over 600,000 lives. Yet in the telling and retelling of the nation's most traumatic conflict, such details acquired outsized significance. For the potential role of Frederick Johnson, a free black man who may have fired the first Union shot in a war that would eventually transform into a struggle for emancipation, the details matter even more. The erasure of his possible contribution reflects the larger erasure of black participation in the early stages of the Civil War, when official policy still treated it as a conflict solely about Union rather than slavery. In 1863, after the Emancipation Proclamation changed the formal aims of the war, more than 180,000 black men would serve in the Union Army and Navy. Their contributions would be recognized, if incompletely, in post-war histories. But the black sailors and soldiers who served in the war's first hours and days often disappeared from the record entirely. A report filed by Naval Secretary Gideon Welles in July 1862 noted that colored seamen have served aboard Union vessels since hostilities commenced, but provided no specific numbers or names. An 1864 inventory of naval personnel listed 923 men of color in service, but offered no information on when they had enlisted or where they had served. The records of the Star of the West present a particular challenge. When Confederate forces captured the Gosport Navy Yard in Norfolk, Virginia in April 1861, they seized substantial Union naval records. Many were destroyed when Union forces retook the yard a year later. Others were transported to Richmond and later burned during the Confederate government's evacuation of the city in April 1865. What survived often did so by chance. Papers taken home by officers, copies filed in secondary locations, fragments preserved by individuals who recognized their potential historical significance. The crew manifest that lists Frederick Johnson exists only because Quartermaster Winters apparently kept a copy among his personal papers rather than filing it solely through official channels. The partial documentation leaves historians with questions that will likely never be definitively answered. Did Frederick Johnson truly fire the first Union shot of the Civil War? Was he specifically ordered to do so, or did he act on initiative when Confederate fire approached the Star of the West? How did his commanding officers react to his action? Did he face repercussions or recognition? The gaps in the record frustrate attempts to construct a complete narrative. Historian Wilson, who discovered the Winterton Morris correspondence in 1941, noted in her research journal, The story of this sailor represents hundreds of similar stories now lost to history. Black Americans whose contributions to the Union cause went largely unrecorded and unacknowledged. A naval roster discovered in 1878 in a warehouse in Brooklyn added another layer to the mystery. It listed F. Johnson among the crew of the USS Minnesota in September 1861, but with a notation, reassigned to special duty by order of Captain Van Brunt. The nature of this special duty was not specified, nor was there explanation for why a common sailor would receive such an assignment. The historical record falls silent on Frederick Johnson after 1865. If the census entry refers to the same man, he lived at least 4 more years before his death in the winter of 1868 to 1869, as referenced in Deacon Morris's letter. He would have been approximately 35 years old, a relatively young man, though perhaps aged beyond his years by war service and whatever illness eventually claimed him. What makes Johnson's story particularly significant is its timing. In April 1861, the Union had not yet committed to making the war about emancipation. Indeed, early Union policy explicitly disavowed any intention to interfere with slavery where it existed. President Lincoln's primary goal was preserving the Union, not freeing the enslaved. The Confiscation Acts, which declared enslaved people used to support the Confederate war effort to be contraband of war, would not be passed until August 1861. The Emancipation Proclamation lay nearly 2 years in the future. Black men would not be officially recruited into the Union Army until 1863. In this context, a free black sailor firing what may have been the first Union shot of the war carries symbolic weight that later generations would recognize, even if Johnson's contemporaries did not. His action represented the kind of contribution that Black Americans had always made to the nation's conflicts, present from the beginning, often unacknowledged in official narratives. The complex relationship between black military service and the cause of emancipation was embodied in men like Frederick Johnson, free black Americans serving a country that had not yet committed to freedom for all black Americans. Their presence in uniform represented both the reality of black patriotism and the contradictions of a nation still defined by racial hierarchy. The official Union narrative that emerged after the war emphasized restraint at Fort Sumter, the dignity of Major Anderson waiting hours before returning Confederate fire, the reluctance with which the North entered the conflict. This narrative served political purposes in Reconstruction and beyond, positioning the Union as the aggrieved but restrained party. A more complicated story, one that included a black sailor on a supply ship firing back at Confederate vessels before the fort itself responded, did not fit neatly into this narrative. Whether intentionally suppressed or simply lost in the fog of war and its aftermath, Frederick Johnson's potential role receded from public memory. In 1892, a reunion of Union veterans who had served at Charleston Harbor in April 1861 was held in New York. According to a brief newspaper account, an elderly black man attempted to join the proceedings but was turned away. The article noted only that he claimed to have served aboard a federal vessel during the bombardment and was unable to provide satisfactory proof of such service. Whether this was Frederick Johnson is impossible to determine, though the timing would make him around 58 years old, certainly plausible. In 1915, historian Charles Wilson published The Opening Guns, a re-examination of Fort Sumter, which briefly referenced accounts suggesting that a supply vessel exchanged fire with Confederate batteries before Major Anderson ordered his guns into action. Wilson noted the contradiction, but concluded that such accounts lack sufficient documentation to warrant revision of the established sequence of events. He made no mention of Frederick Johnson or any black sailors present during the bombardment. A survey of naval records conducted in 1932 by the War Department identified 8 black sailors known to have been present in Charleston Harbor during the Fort Sumter crisis. Frederick Johnson's name appeared on this list with the notation, "Service record incomplete. Status during bombardment unconfirmed." The question of who fired the first Union shot of the Civil War remains officially unresolved. Major Anderson's report that Fort Sumter held fire until 7:30 in the morning of April 12th has been the accepted historical account, yet the fragmented evidence surrounding the Star of the West and Frederick Johnson suggests a more complex reality, one in which the response to Confederate aggression may have come earlier from an unexpected source. In 1939, a plaque commemorating the opening of hostilities was placed at Fort Sumter National Monument. It stated simply, "At 4:30 on the morning of April 12, 1861, Confederate batteries opened fire on this fort. At 7:30, Fort Sumter returned fire." The Civil War had begun. No mention was made of the Star of the West or any actions by Union naval vessels in the harbor. The historical obscurity that enveloped Frederick Johnson extended to his final resting place. If Deacon Morris's letter is accurate, Johnson was buried in Philadelphia with the simple epitaph, "He served when called." Cemetery records from the period are incomplete, and many 19th century graves, particularly those of black Americans, have been lost to urban development or neglect. In April 1961, on the centennial of the Fort Sumter bombardment, historians again examined the opening hours of the conflict. A brief article in the Journal of American History mentioned discrepancies in accounts of naval actions in Charleston Harbor, but concluded that insufficient primary sources exist to definitively establish whether Union vessels returned fire before Fort Sumter's guns engaged, and so the question remains suspended in historical uncertainty. Did a free black sailor named Frederick Johnson fire the first Union shot of the American Civil War? The fragmented evidence neither conclusively confirms nor refutes the possibility. What can be said with reasonable certainty is that black sailors were present from the conflict's first hours, their contributions often unrecorded in official histories and forgotten in public commemorations. For Frederick Johnson himself, if the scattered records indeed refer to the same man, recognition never came. He lived approximately 8 years after the war began, apparently never telling his own story in any form that survived. His experience, like those of so many black Americans who served the Union cause, was preserved only in fragments that historians must struggle to piece together. The story of Fort Sumter, of the Star of the West, and of Frederick Johnson reminds us that history is not simply what happened, but what was recorded, preserved, and chosen for remembrance. In the gaps and silences of the historical record lie countless stories that might have changed our understanding of the past, had they only been deemed worthy of preservation. To this day, naval historians disagree about whether the Star of the West actually returned fire during the bombardment of Fort Sumter. Some maintain that Lieutenant Gardner's letter to his brother represents the most credible account, while others point to the absence of confirmation in official reports. The contradictions may never be fully resolved. What remains undisputed is that Frederick Johnson, a free black man from Philadelphia, served his country from the opening moments of its greatest crisis, one of many black Americans whose contributions would be belatedly acknowledged, incompletely recorded, or entirely forgotten. In April 2011, on the 150th anniversary of the bombardment of Fort Sumter, a historical journal published a comprehensive review of all known documentation related to the opening hours of the Civil War. The article concluded, "While Major Anderson's restraint at Fort Sumter has been established beyond reasonable doubt, the actions of Union naval vessels in Charleston Harbor remain insufficiently documented for definitive conclusions." The possibility that the first Union shot of the Civil War came not from Fort Sumter, but from a naval gun, possibly manned by a sailor of African descent, represents one of the enduring mysteries of this pivotal moment in American history. The journal noted that efforts to locate Frederick Johnson's grave in Philadelphia had been unsuccessful. If he lies in an unmarked grave, or one whose marker has disappeared with time, he shares this fate with countless other black veterans of America's conflicts, present at creation, absent in commemoration. Until today, neither naval records nor historical consensus have definitively established who fired the first Union shot of the Civil War. The enduring official narrative focuses on Fort Sumter and Major Anderson's restrained response to Confederate aggression. Yet the fragmentary evidence surrounding Frederick Johnson and the Star of the West suggests a more complex reality, one in which the first Union response to Confederate fire might have come from the hands of a free black sailor from Philadelphia. Such is the nature of history. Partial, fragmentary, shaped by what was preserved and what was lost, by what was deemed worth recording and what was considered unworthy of memory. In the silence surrounding Frederick Johnson's service lies a larger silence about the role of black Americans in the nation's defining conflict. Present from the first shot to the last surrender, their contributions often unacknowledged in official narratives, but no less real for that absence. The harbor at Charleston looks different today than it did on that April morning in 1861. Fort Sumter stands as a monument rather than a military installation. The waters where the Star of the West once anchored now see pleasure craft rather than warships. The silence that fell after 34 hours of bombardment has given way to the sounds of tourism and commemoration. Somewhere in that harbor, a 3-pound shot fired from a naval gun may rest in the silt of the harbor bottom, perhaps the first projectile sent toward Confederate forces by Union hands. And somewhere in Philadelphia, in a grave that history has lost track of, may lie the remains of the man who fired it. His epitaph, if Deacon Morris is to be believed, tells his story with simple dignity: he served when called. In the complex tapestry of American history, Frederick Johnson represents a thread nearly lost, a free black man who may have fired the first Union shot of the Civil War, who served a nation not yet committed to universal freedom, who disappeared from official memory even as the conflict he helped initiate transformed into a struggle for emancipation. His story, pieced together from fragments, reminds us that history is not merely what is proudly proclaimed, but also what is quietly forgotten. Until today, nearly 165 years after Confederate batteries opened fire on Fort Sumter, the question of who fired the first Union shot of the Civil War remains officially unresolved. But in the fragments of records that survived the conflict and its aftermath, lies the possibility that this distinction belongs to a free black sailor from Philadelphia, a man who served when called, even when history would not remember his name. In the years following the war, as historians began piecing together the narrative of America's bloodiest conflict, certain stories received prominence while others faded into obscurity. The bombardment of Fort Sumter, 34 hours that resulted in no casualties but ignited 4 years of devastating warfare, became fixed in the national consciousness as the moment the Civil War began. Yet the full story of those first hours contains ambiguities that official histories have never fully resolved. In 1886, a curious document surfaced in the collection of a Massachusetts attorney named Hiram Woodson. Among papers purchased at an estate sale was a ship's log from the Star of the West, covering the period from March 28th to April 14th, 1861. The log, apparently kept by a junior officer, contained an entry for April 12th that read, 0438, Confederate batteries opened on Fort Sumter and our position. 0442, fired warning shot toward rebel steamer approaching from Eastern Harbor. Gunner Johnson at Portside 3-pounder. Woodson brought this log to the attention of the Massachusetts Historical Society, where it was examined by several scholars. In their assessment, published in the Society's quarterly journal, they noted that the handwriting appeared authentic for the period, but they could not verify the log's provenance with absolute certainty. The document subsequently disappeared during the Historical Society's relocation to new premises in 1897, and its current whereabouts remain unknown. The log's brief existence in the historical record added another tantalizing fragment to the puzzle of Frederick Johnson. If authentic, it provided the most specific timing yet for the possible first Union shot of the Civil War, just 4 minutes after Confederate batteries opened fire on Fort Sumter, nearly 3 hours before Major Anderson ordered his garrison to return fire. Naval historian Commander James Farrell, writing in 1913, devoted 3 pages of his complete naval history of the Civil War to the question of actions by Union vessels during the bombardment. He cited the Woodson log as potentially significant but unverifiable, and noted that, if authentic, this document would establish that Union naval forces responded to Confederate aggression before the garrison at Fort Sumter, and that a colored seaman named Johnson may have fired this historic first shot. Farrell added, "The naval dimension of Fort Sumter's bombardment has been consistently under-examined by historians focused on Army actions. Yet supply vessels, including the Star of the West, were essential to the fort's survival and were positioned in the harbor during the opening hours of the conflict. Their actions and the actions of their crews represent a gap in our understanding of how hostilities actually commenced." In 1921, a letter written by Commodore James Armstrong, who commanded Union naval forces near Charleston in April 1861, was discovered in family papers donated to the Naval Historical Center. Dated May 2, 1861, the letter to a fellow officer mentioned that vessels under my command were instructed to avoid engagement unless directly fired upon, though one incident of counterfire occurred during the early stages of the bombardment when the Star of the West discharged a warning shot after rebel shells fell near her position. Armstrong's letter made no mention of which crew member fired this shot, and he characterized it as merely a warning to keep rebel. Vessels at appropriate distance, not formally commencing hostilities. This qualification suggests the political sensitivity surrounding the question of who fired first, and perhaps why naval actions during the bombardment received less attention in official reports than the response from Fort Sumter itself. A different perspective emerged in 1874, when former Confederate naval officer Lieutenant Thomas Ruffin published his memoir, 4 Years Under the Stars and Bars. Ruffin, who had commanded a small rebel steamer in Charleston Harbor during the bombardment, wrote, "Shortly after our batteries opened on the fort, we observed a flash from one of the Federal supply ships anchored beyond our range. A shot splashed harmlessly in the water some 50 yards from our bow. We took this as confirmation that hostilities had fully commenced and proceeded with our assignment to prevent any approach to the fort." Ruffin's account is significant for providing Confederate confirmation that a Union vessel fired early in the bombardment. However, like most sources, it does not identify the individual who manned the gun, focusing instead on the tactical situation from the Confederate perspective. The question of Frederick Johnson's role might have remained a historical footnote were it not for the emergence of another document in 1934. Among papers being processed at the National Archives was a previously uncatalogued collection of interviews conducted by the War Department in 1865 and 1866 with veterans of the conflict's earliest engagements. One interview, dated September 12, 1865, was with a surgeon named Dr. Walter Prescott, who had served aboard the USS Pawnee near Charleston in April 1861. Though not stationed on the Star of the West, Prescott claimed familiarity with the vessel and its actions during the bombardment. The interviewer recorded his statement. "I recall hearing officers discuss that the Star had exchanged fire with rebel vessels early in the bombardment. What caused some comment was that the gun crew included a colored man who reportedly handled himself with distinct professionalism during the exchange. Some officers found this worthy of note, though I cannot speak to the accuracy of the account." This third-hand report adds little concrete information, but does suggest that Johnson's role was known among naval officers, even if it did not make its way into official reports. The comment that officers found a black sailor's professional performance worthy of note reflects the prejudices of the era, and perhaps one reason why Johnson's contribution went unacknowledged in formal histories. In 1945, historian Rebecca Jenkins published The Naval War: Forgotten Dimensions of the Civil War, which included a chapter on the Fort Sumter bombardment. Jenkins devoted several pages to the actions of the Star of the West, synthesizing the fragmentary evidence about Frederick Johnson. She wrote, "While definitive proof may never emerge, substantial circumstantial evidence suggests that a free black sailor named Frederick Johnson, serving aboard the Star of the West, fired what may have been the first Union shot of the Civil War. The historical significance of this possibility, that the first Union response to Confederate aggression came from a black American, has been consistently overlooked in standard narratives of the conflict's beginning." Jenkins noted the irony that Johnson's action, if verified, would have taken place nearly 2 years before the Emancipation Proclamation officially aligned the Union cause with black freedom, and almost 3 years before black men were officially recruited into the Union Army in significant numbers. Johnson's story, she concluded, represents the complex reality of black military service throughout American history, present from the nation's earliest conflicts, but often unacknowledged in official narratives, contributing to a cause that had not yet fully committed to their own liberation. In 1952, a research librarian at Howard University discovered a newspaper clipping from the Philadelphia Press dated August 18, 1869. The brief article, titled "Death of a Veteran," stated, "Frederick Johnson, formerly a seaman in the U.S. Navy who served during the recent conflict, passed away at his residence on Lombard Street following a prolonged illness. Johnson, a free man of color born in this city, was reported to have been present during the bombardment of Fort Sumter that commenced hostilities in April 1861. He is survived by a sister." This obituary provided the first public acknowledgement of Johnson's naval service in a contemporary publication, though it made no mention of his possible historic role. The reference to a surviving sister tantalizes historians with the possibility that family records or oral traditions might have preserved information about Johnson that official documents did not, but no such materials have been discovered. In 1956, historian Martin Delaney, no relation to the Civil War-era black leader of the same name, attempted to locate Johnson's grave based on the obituary's reference to Philadelphia. City burial records from 1869 listed 3 Frederick Johnsons interred that year, 2 in segregated colored cemeteries. One entry noted the deceased as age approx 35, former U.S. Navy, which matches what is known about the sailor from the Star of the West. The cemetery in question, however, had been relocated in the 1890s for urban development, and many graves, particularly those of black Philadelphians, were either moved without documentation or lost entirely. No marker for Frederick Johnson has been located in any of the city's existing cemeteries. In 1963, during the Civil War centennial and amid the escalating civil rights movement, the Johnson story briefly resurfaced in an academic article by Dr. N. William Thompson titled "Black Sailors in Blue, African Americans in the Union Navy." Thompson cited the fragmentary evidence about Johnson and concluded, "While absolute verification may be impossible, The preponderance of evidence suggests that Frederick Johnson, a free black sailor from Philadelphia, fired what may have been the first shot from Union forces during the Civil War, an action that went unacknowledged in his lifetime and has been largely forgotten since. Thompson's article received little attention outside academic circles, and Johnson remained absent from popular histories and commemorations of the Civil War. Fort Sumter National Monument, established in 1948, made no mention of Johnson or the naval dimension of the bombardment in its initial exhibits, focusing instead on Major Anderson and the fort's garrison. In 1977, naval historian Rear Admiral Thomas Bowen, retired, published The Naval War Begins, Charleston Harbor, April 1861, which examined in detail the positions and actions of all vessels present during the Fort Sumter bombardment. Using charts, logs, and personal accounts, Bowen reconstructed the likely positions of Union and Confederate vessels during each hour of the 34-hour engagement. Regarding the Star of the West, Bowen wrote, "Available evidence strongly suggests that at approximately 4:40 in the morning of April 12th, as Confederate batteries focused their fire on Fort Sumter, the Star of the West fired at least one shot toward Confederate vessels approaching her position. This would constitute the first return fire from Union forces, preceding Major Anderson's order for the fort to respond by nearly 3 hours." Bowen cited Lieutenant Gardner's letter to his brother, Quartermaster Winter's correspondence with Deacon Morris, the log discovered by Hiram Woodson, and Confederate Lieutenant Ruffin's memoir as mutually reinforcing evidence that such an exchange occurred. On the question of Frederick Johnson specifically, Bowen noted, "Multiple independent sources identify a sailor named Johnson, described as a colored seaman, as manning one of the Star of the West's guns during this exchange." While absolute proof may remain elusive, the consistency of these references across sources with no obvious connection to each other lends credibility to the account. In 1988, the National Park Service revised its exhibits at Fort Sumter National Monument. A small panel titled "The Naval Dimension" was added, which mentioned that Union supply vessels, including the Star of the West, were positioned in Charleston Harbor during the bombardment, and that some accounts suggest an exchange of fire between these vessels and approaching Confederate ships in the early hours of April 12th, though official reports focus primarily on the fort itself. The panel made no mention of Frederick Johnson or any black sailors present during the engagement. When questioned about this omission by a reporter from the Charleston Post and Courier, the site historian responded that while intriguing, the evidence regarding individual sailors' actions during the bombardment lacks the documentary confirmation required for inclusion in our official interpretation. In 1994, the U.S. Navy established a historical review committee to examine the contributions of black sailors in American conflicts prior to World War II. The committee's report, published in 1996, included a section on the Fort Sumter crisis that stated, "Although official naval reports from April 1861 do not provide definitive confirmation, substantial circumstantial evidence suggests that Frederick Johnson, a free black sailor serving aboard the Star of the West, may have fired the first shot from Union forces during the bombardment of Fort Sumter. This would place a black American at the literal firing line in the opening moments of the Civil War." The report recommended that the Navy incorporate this possibility into its official historical materials, noting that, even in the absence of absolute certainty, the preponderance of evidence warrants acknowledgement of Johnson's potential historic role. Whether this recommendation was implemented remains unclear, as the Navy's public historical materials continue to focus primarily on the fort's garrison rather than naval forces in the harbor. In 2001, historian Catherine Williams published Frederick Johnson and Historical Memory, Race, Service, and the beginning of the Civil War. Williams argued that Johnson's absence from standard narratives of Fort Sumter reflected broader patterns of historical erasure regarding black military service. The possibility that the first Union shot of the Civil War came from a black sailor, she wrote, challenges comfortable narratives about how and why the conflict began. It introduces race into the story from the very first moment, rather than as a factor that emerged later with emancipation. Perhaps most significantly, it centers black agency rather than black victimhood in the narrative of a war that would ultimately transform American conceptions of citizenship and freedom. Williams noted that despite the fragmentary nature of the evidence about Johnson, historians routinely accept equally fragmentary evidence about white historical figures. The standard for historical proof, she argued, often seems higher when the historical actor in question is black, particularly when their actions challenge established narratives about race and national identity. In 2011, on the 150th anniversary of the bombardment of Fort Sumter, a symposium at the University of South Carolina included a panel discussion titled, "Who Fired First?" Naval Actions in Charleston Harbor, April 1861. The panel, which included military historians, naval scholars, and archivists, reviewed all known documentation related to the Star of the West and Frederick Johnson. The consensus statement issued afterward noted, while absolute certainty may remain elusive due to the fragmentary nature of surviving records, substantial evidence suggests that a black sailor named Frederick Johnson, serving aboard the Star of the West, fired what may have been the first shot from Union forces during the Civil War. This action, occurring nearly 2 years before the Emancipation Proclamation and 3 years before large-scale recruitment of black soldiers, represents an important but largely overlooked dimension of African American military service. The symposium recommended that the National Park Service update its interpretation at Fort Sumter National Monument to include this possibility. As of 2025, the site's exhibits mention that some accounts suggest Union naval vessels exchanged fire with Confederate ships early in the bombardment, but make no specific reference to Frederick Johnson. The historical obscurity that has enveloped Johnson for more than 160 years reflects broader patterns in how American history has been recorded, preserved, and commemorated. Black Americans who served in the nation's military have often found their contributions minimized or omitted from official narratives, particularly when those contributions challenge established understandings of racial hierarchy and national identity. For Frederick Johnson, a free black man who may have fired the first Union shot of the Civil War, who served a nation not yet committed to universal freedom, who disappeared from official memory even as the conflict he helped initiate transformed into a struggle for emancipation. This pattern of erasure has meant that his potential historic role remains a footnote rather than a centerpiece in narratives of the conflict's beginning. The fragmented evidence surrounding Johnson reminds us that history is not simply what happened, but what was recorded, preserved, and chosen for remembrance. In the gaps and silences of the historical record lie countless stories that might have changed our understanding of the past had they only been deemed worthy of preservation. Among the thousands of black sailors who served in the Union Navy during the Civil War, constituting approximately 25% of naval personnel by the conflict's end, Frederick Johnson stands as a representative figure, present from the beginning, serving with distinction according to those who witnessed his actions, yet largely absent from official histories and public commemorations. As Naval Secretary Gideon Welles noted in his report of July 1862, colored seamen have served aboard Union vessels since hostilities commenced. What Welles did not say, perhaps did not know, or chose not to emphasize, was that one of those seamen may have fired the first Union shot of the conflict that would ultimately transform America's understanding of freedom and citizenship. Today, the waters of Charleston Harbor reveal nothing of the events that transpired there on April 12, 1861. Fort Sumter stands as a monument rather than a military installation. The positions where the Star of the West and other Union vessels anchored show no trace of their presence. The silence that fell after 34 hours of bombardment has given way to the sounds of tourism and commemoration. Somewhere in that harbor, a 3-pound shot fired from a naval gun may rest in the silt of the harbor bottom, perhaps the first projectile sent toward Confederate forces by Union hands. And somewhere in Philadelphia, in a grave that history has lost track of, may lie the remains of the man who fired it. His epitaph, if Deacon Morris is to be believed, tells his story with simple dignity. He served when called. The hunt for conclusive evidence about Frederick Johnson continues. In 2021, researchers at the National Archives announced a project to digitize and analyze previously uncatalogued naval records from 1860 to 1865, with particular attention to documentation of black sailors' service. The project's initial findings, published in 2023, identified 17 additional references to sailors named Johnson serving aboard Union vessels during the war, though none could be definitively linked to the Frederick Johnson of the Star of the West. In 2024, historians at the Philadelphia African American Museum launched a community-based research initiative to identify unmarked graves of black Civil War veterans in the city's historic cemeteries. Using ground-penetrating radar and archival research, the project has identified several potential locations for Frederick Johnson's final resting place, though verification remains challenging due to incomplete burial records from the period. As these efforts continue, the question of who fired the first Union shot of the Civil War remains officially unresolved. The accepted historical narrative focuses on Fort Sumter and Major Anderson's restrained response to Confederate aggression. Yet the fragmentary evidence surrounding Frederick Johnson and the Star of the West suggests a more complex reality, one in which the first Union response to Confederate fire might have come from the hands of a free black sailor from Philadelphia. In the complex tapestry of American history, Frederick Johnson represents a thread nearly lost, a free black man who may have fired the first Union shot of the Civil War, who served a nation not yet committed to universal freedom, who disappeared from official memory even as the conflict he helped initiate transformed into a struggle for emancipation. His story, pieced together from fragments, reminds us that history is not merely what is proudly proclaimed, but also what is quietly forgotten. This narrative itself becomes part of the ongoing effort to recover and preserve the contributions of black Americans to the nation's military history, contributions that began not with executive orders or policy directives, but with individual acts of service and courage in moments of crisis. Frederick Johnson, manning his gun aboard the Star of the West as Confederate batteries opened fire on Fort Sumter, embodied such service and courage at the very moment the nation's greatest crisis began. Until today, nearly 165 years after Confederate batteries opened fire on Fort Sumter, the question of who fired the first Union shot of the Civil War remains officially unresolved. But in the fragments of records that survived the conflict and its aftermath lies the possibility that this distinction belongs to a free black sailor from Philadelphia, a man who served when called, even when history would not remember his name. For those who study the Civil War and its legacy, the story of Frederick Johnson offers a reminder that black Americans were not merely passive beneficiaries of a freedom bestowed by white political leaders, but active participants in the struggle from its very first moments. Their service, often unacknowledged, incompletely recorded, or entirely forgotten, helped shape the nation that emerged from 4 years of bloody conflict. In the silence surrounding Frederick Johnson's service lies a larger silence about the role of Black Americans in the nation's defining conflict, present from the first shot to the last surrender, their contributions often unacknowledged in official narratives, but no less real for that absence. As we continue to examine and re-examine the Civil War and its meaning, such silences demand our attention, not merely as historiographical curiosities, but as essential elements of a fuller, more inclusive understanding of how America became what it is today. The harbor at Charleston looks different now than it did on that April morning in 1861. Fort Sumter stands as a monument to a conflict long concluded. The waters where the Star of the West once anchored now see pleasure craft rather than warships. The silence that fell after 34 hours of bombardment has given way to the sounds of tourism and commemoration. Somewhere in that harbor, a 3-pound shot fired from a naval gun may rest in the silt of the harbor bottom, perhaps the first projectile sent toward Confederate forces by Union hands. And somewhere in Philadelphia, in a grave whose location has been lost to time, lie the remains of the man who may have fired it. His epitaph, according to a letter written more than 150 years ago, tells his story with simple dignity. He served when called. It is perhaps fitting that Frederick Johnson's potential historic role remains neither definitively confirmed nor definitively refuted, suspended in the ambiguity that characterizes so much of Black military service in American history. Present but unacknowledged, essential but marginalized, commemorated belatedly, if at all. Yet the very act of recovering these fragments, of piecing together this narrative from scattered references and partial records, represents a form of historical reckoning, an acknowledgement that the standard narratives of American history have often overlooked or minimized the contributions of Black Americans, even at pivotal moments like the beginning of the Civil War. For Frederick Johnson, recognition never came in life. If Deacon Morris's letter is accurate, he died in the winter of 1868 to 1869, approximately 8 years after serving aboard the Star of the West during the bombardment of Fort Sumter. Whether he knew of the potential historical significance of his actions that April morning, whether he ever spoke of firing what may have been the first Union shot of the Civil War, we cannot know. What we do know from the fragments that survive is that he was there, a free Black man from Philadelphia, serving his country from the opening moments of its greatest crisis. That service, and the service of thousands of other Black sailors and soldiers who followed, helped preserve the Union and transform it into something new. A nation that, however imperfectly, embraced the principle that freedom cannot be restricted by race. In the continuing effort to understand the Civil War and its legacy, the story of Frederick Johnson reminds us that history consists not only of what was documented and preserved, but also of what was overlooked, forgotten, or deliberately erased. The fragments of his story that survive challenge us to consider what other stories might lie buried in archives or lost to time. Stories that might transform our understanding of the past, if only we could recover them. As the nation continues to grapple with questions of race, citizenship, and belonging, questions that were central to the Civil War and remain unresolved more than 160 years later, the story of Frederick Johnson offers a reminder that Black Americans have been present and participating in that struggle from its very first moments, even when their contributions went unrecognized. Until today, the question of who fired the first Union shot of the Civil War remains officially unresolved. The enduring official narrative focuses on Fort Sumter and Major Anderson's restrained response to Confederate aggression. Yet the fragmentary evidence surrounding Frederick Johnson and the Star of the West suggests a more complex reality, one in which the first Union response to Confederate fire might have come from the hands of a free black sailor from Philadelphia. Such is the nature of history, partial, fragmentary, shaped by what was preserved and what was lost, by what was deemed worth recording and what was considered unworthy of memory. In the silence surrounding Frederick Johnson's service lies a larger silence about the role of Black Americans in the nation's defining conflict, present from the first shot to the last surrender, their contributions often unacknowledged in official narratives, but no less real for that absence.